The benchmark for most investors and one of the most watched indexes around the world is the S&P 500. The S&P 500 is broken out into 11 different sectors: consumer discretionary, consumer staples, energy, financials, healthcare, industrials, information technology, materials, communication services, utilities, and real estate, which was the newest sector added back in 2016. When it comes to building a successful portfolio for the long term, there's two key components: patience and diversification. Diversification keeps you from being overly exposed to one particular sector. And in today's video, we're going to take a look at all 11 S&P 500 sectors and give you a few top ETF suggestions in each and every one of those. But before we do me a huge favor, click that like button down below, subscribe to the channel, and let's jump into it. Hey everyone, Mark Rusin here, back for another video. As always, I'm a CPA and not a financial advisor, so please do not take this as financial advice. And before we begin, let me thank today's video sponsor, which is The Motley Fool. The Motley Fool has a ton of great resources and products available for investors of all different levels. And right now, if you go to fool.com/Mark, you could sign up to receive their 10 best stocks to buy right now. So with that being said, let's not waste any more time and jump into today's video, beginning with our first sector, which is consumer discretionary. The consumer discretionary can be thought of as non-essential goods. This is usually a very cyclical sector, meaning when budgets get tight, consumer discretionary type items are things that we can pull back on. When it comes to the consumer discretionary sector, we're going to highlight two separate ETFs, one being XLY, which is the Consumer Discretionary Select Sector Spider ETF, the other being FDIS, which is the Fidelity MSCI Consumer Discretionary ETF. Let's first look at the performance of the S&P 500 so we can have something to compare to. Over the past 10 years, the S&P 500 has a total return rate of 225%. XLY over the past 10 years has returned 210%, with FDIS returning 237%, outperforming its competitor and the S&P 500 at the same time. The next thing we're going to take a look at are expense fees. It's very important to pay attention to expense fees when investing in index funds, mutual funds, and ETFs because these can really eat into your total return over a long period of time. XLY has an expense fee of 0.09%, FDIS an expense fee of 0.08%. So no major difference between the two, and both are great low-cost options. Now let's take a look at the ETF's top holdings side by side. XLY's top holdings include Amazon, Tesla, Home Depot, McDonald's, and Lowe's. The top 10 positions account for nearly 70% of the ETF, and in totality, it has 54 total positions. When looking at FDIS, top positions include Amazon, Tesla, Home Depot, McDonald's, and Bookings, almost identical from the top 5 position. The top 10 positions account for nearly 60%, and this ETF has more holdings at nearly 300 separate holdings. So when it comes to investing in the consumer discretionary sector, it's going to be a lot more cyclical. So you really got to understand where the economy is at a whole. Let's move on to sector number 2, which is consumer staples. Where consumer discretionary was non-essential, consumer staples are essential goods. The two ETFs we're going to be highlighting today include XLP, which is the Consumer Staples Select Sector Spider ETF, as well as IYK, the iShares US Consumer Staples ETF. The 10-year total return for XLP is 128%. For IYK, it's 159%. It is important to remember that the consumer staples sector is a little bit more on the defensive sector. When times get tough in the economy, these are still needs that we have to have for everyday life. When it comes to the expense fee, XLP has an expense fee of just 0.09%, making it a great low-cost option. However, IYK has an expense fee of 0.4%, so much higher and still below my threshold of 0.5%, so we'll still consider it somewhat low cost. In terms of the dividend, both ETFs produce a nice little dividend. XLP with a yield of 2.6%, IYK with a dividend yield of 2.7%. Again, not a huge fan for that higher expense fee for IYK. However, when we look at total performance, it's been backing it up. Now let's take a look at the top holdings of each side by side. The top holdings for XLP include Procter & Gamble, Costco, Coca-Cola, PepsiCo, and Walmart. In total, the ETF has 39 total holdings, and the top 10 account for nearly 69%. Looking at IYK, their top holdings include Procter & Gamble, Coca-Cola, PepsiCo, Philip Morris, and CVS. In total, the ETF has 59 total options, with the top 10 accounting for 66%. Now let's move on to our third sector, which is the energy sector. We went from the consumer staples sector, which was very defensive. Energy is even more of a defensive sector. Think about, even when the economy gets rough, we still need to use energy resources. For example, in 2022, the S&P 500 was down nearly 20% on the year. However, the XLE, which is the energy ETF we're going to take a look at today, was up roughly 60%, 6-0 in 2022. As I mentioned, the ETF we're going to look at that focuses on the energy sector is XLE, the Energy Select Sector SPDR ETF. Over the past 10 years, it has a total return rate of 46%. The energy sector, although it is more defensive, can still be volatile at times. Supply and demand goes into it. OPEC's production or cuts go into it. The underlying commodity prices, and is there any unrest going on in the Middle East where a lot of oil is drilled, can all impact the price of all of these energy stocks. In terms of expense fee, XLE is a low-cost ETF with an expense fee of 0.09%. It does, however, provide a nice sized dividend at 3.5%. Now let's take a look at the ETF's top holdings, which include ExxonMobil and Chevron, both accounting for nearly 40% of the ETF, followed by ConocoPhillips, EOG, and Marathon Petroleum rounding out the top 5. In total, the XLE has 26 total holdings, with the top 10 accounting for nearly 76% of the entire ETF. When it comes to the energy sector, it's just not a sector that I track a lot of individual stocks. So when I'm looking for exposure to this sector, I invest in XLE. That brings us to our next sector, which is the financial sector. Think of things like banks, institutions, as well as investment brokers. The two ETFs we'll be highlighting today include XLF, the Financial Select Sector SPDR ETF, as well as VFH, which is the Vanguard Financials ETF. Over the past 10 years, XLF has returned 173%, with VFH returning 168% over that same 10-year period. The financial sector is another sector that can add some volatility, depending on what the economy is doing. If the economy is expanding and companies are looking to take out more debt to grow, this is going to benefit financial institutions. In terms of expense fees for these two ETFs, XLF has an expense fee of 0.09, with VFH having an expense fee of 0.10. So both of them considered to be low-cost ETFs. Both of these ETFs have smaller dividends, with XLF having a dividend yield of 1.6% and VFH having a dividend yield of 1.5%. Now let's take a look at the ETF's top holdings side by side. XLF's top 5 holdings include Berkshire, JP Morgan Chase, Visa, MasterCard, and Bank of America. In total, it has 75 total holdings, with the top 10 accounting for 55%. VFH, on the other hand, top holdings include JP Morgan, Berkshire, Visa, MasterCard, and Bank of America, with 397 total holdings, and the top 10 accounting for 43%. So really, when it comes down to it, when looking at both of these ETFs, it comes down to exposure rate of those top 10 holdings and the sheer number of holdings within each of these ETFs. And that brings us to our next sector, which is the healthcare sector, another very defensive leaning sector. Regardless of what the economy is doing, whether it's booming or whether it's in a recession, we have to take care of our health. And the two ETFs we're going to look at today are XLV, which is the Healthcare Select Sector SPDR ETF, and then IXJ, the iShares Global Healthcare ETF. XLV has a 10-year total return of 192%, with IXJ having a 10-year total return of 135%. There will be some crossover, as you'll see below, between the two ETFs, but what IXJ brings to the table is that global. You're getting more global and some international stocks added into your ETF. When it comes to expense fees, XLV is a low-cost option at 0.09%. However, IXJ has a much higher expense fee at 0.42%. So we've had a higher expense fee and it has underperformed. So I'm leaning towards XLV so far. Both of these ETFs produce a nice little dividend, with XLV having a dividend yield of 1.5%, IXJ having a dividend yield of 1.3%. So as I mentioned, IXJ is a global ETF option. So it's going to give you a lot more names outside of the US. And one of those names high on my list is Novo Nordisk. Here's a look at the top 10 holdings for each side by side, beginning with XLV, which has Eli Lilly, United Health, Johnson & Johnson, Merck, and AbbVie rounding out the top 5. In total, it has 65 total holdings, with the top 10 accounting for 55%. IXJ, on the other hand, top positions include Eli Lilly, United Health, Novo Nordisk, Johnson & Johnson, and Merck. In total, it has 129 total positions, with the top 10 accounting for 44%. So with these two, you could see some similarities and some differences. I do like the idea of the lower cost, but I also like the idea of having some more international presence within the ETF as well. So with these two, I think they're a toss-up. And that leads us to our next sector, which is the industrial sector. The industrial sector tends to do best when we come out of a recession or slower economic periods and get into that expansion, that economic expansion period. The two ETFs we will be highlighting today include XLI, which is the Industrial Select Sector Spider ETF, and FIDU, which is the Fidelity MSCI Industrial ETF. Over the past 10 years, XLI has returned 128%, with FIDU returning 159%. In terms of expense fees, XLI has an expense fee of 0.09%, with FIDU having an expense fee of 0.4%. So a little bit of a disconnect there in terms of the expense fees. However, there's also the total return, though, to back it up for FIDU. Now let's take a look at the top ETF holdings side by side, beginning with XLI. Top holdings include Uber, Caterpillar, General Electric, Union Pacific, and RTX, formerly Raytheon. In total, it has 81 total positions, with the top 10 accounting for 37%. Looking at FIDU, top holdings include Caterpillar, General Electric, Union Pacific, Uber, and RTX as well. However, much larger, with 389 total holdings, and the top 10 only accounting for 27%. So again, a lot of similarities between these two. Much higher expense fee for FIDU, but it's also had a much bigger performance. However, when looking at, I like the idea of Uber being the top position there when it comes to XLI. That's why I'm going to lean more towards that. I have no position in either right now, but both of these are great options when looking for that industrial exposure. That leads us to our next sector, our seventh sector, which is the favorite among many of us out there, and that is the information technology sector. Infotech, along with communication services, was far and away the top performing sectors in 2023. However, on the flip side, it was one of the worst performing sectors in 2022. However, everyone seems connected to technology in some sense, and it seems like every great portfolio needs to have at least some exposure, even overexposure, to the technology sector. And in today's video, we're going to be highlighting two great ETFs. One being XLK, the Technology Select Sector Spider ETF, and the other being VGT, the Vanguard Information Technology ETF. Over the past 10 years, these 10-year total returns are amazing. XLK has returned 543%, with VGT returning 521%, hot on its tail. Technology is a great sector, and it is booming right now, especially with artificial intelligence. Everyone trying to have some exposure to technology. And with so many great companies out there, it's really hard to pick and choose individual stocks. That's what makes it a lot easier by investing in an ETF. In terms of expense fee, both of these great low-cost options. XLK with an expense fee of 0.09%, VGT at just 0.1%. Both of these ETFs are filled with a lot of growth stocks, thus they pay very small in terms of dividend. XLK has a dividend yield of 0.9%, VGT at 0.6%. So both of these ETFs are great if you're looking for full 100% information technology exposure. However, if you want a lot of technology exposure, but also don't want to miss out on communication services type, think of things like Meta as well as Alphabet, then QQQ might be another great option, as it has roughly 60% exposure to the technology sector, not the 100% that XLK and VGT have. It's really just what are you looking for. Now let's take a look at the top holdings of both ETFs side by side. For XLK, you see Microsoft, Apple, Nvidia, Broadcom, and AMD with 67 total positions. For VGT, Top 10 positions include Microsoft, Apple, Nvidia, Broadcom, and Adobe. A lot of similarities, however, 315 total positions when it comes to VGT. That leads us to ETF sector number 8, which is the materials sector. This is a sector that typically does well when the industrial sector is doing well, during that economic expansion phase within the economy. And it has really a lot less to do with how efficient you run that particular business and more to do with the demand of that product as well as the price fluctuation of that underlying product as well. The two ETFs we'll be highlighting today include GDX, which is the VanEck Vectors Gold Miners ETF, and XLB, which is the Materials Select Sector Spider ETF. Over the past 10 years, GDX has returned 15%. However, XLB has returned 128%. Obviously, GDX is much more geared towards a particular material, gold that is, gold miners. So if that's what you're looking for, GDX is a great option. If you're looking more for a broad materials type of ETF, then XLB is going to be the perfect ETF for you. In terms of expense fee, GDX has an expense fee of 0.51%, so rather high on my scale there. XLB, on the other hand, just 0.09%. Both of these ETFs also produce a little dividend, with GDX providing 1.9% yield, XLB at 2%. Now let's take a look at the top holdings of both of these ETFs. For GDX, they include Newmont Corp, Barrick Gold, Agnico, Franco, and Wheaton. Obviously, much more predicated towards gold miners. XLB, on the other hand, Linde, Sherwin-Williams, Ecolab, Freeport, Air Products, and Nucor. In total, just 31 holdings, however. This is a sector I've really been underexposed to for a number of years. I just really don't track many companies within the materials sector. And that leads us to sector number 9, which is communication services. As we talked about information technology being the top performing sector in 2023, communication services was the second best performing sector, led by the likes of Meta Platforms as well as Alphabet. The two ETFs we'll be highlighting today include XLC, which is the Communication Services Select Sector Spider ETF, and VOX, which is the Vanguard Communication Services ETF. XLC, which was just created in 2018, so we're just going to look at the 5-year total return, has a 5-year total return rate of 79%, with VOX having a 5-year total return of 62%. Communication services is really the tale of two different types, the new age and the old age. Old age being the likes of AT&T and Verizon, new age being the likes of Meta Platforms, Alphabet, and the likes of Netflix. In terms of expense fees, XLC has an expense fee of just 0.09%, with VOX having an expense fee of 0.1%, so both very low-cost options. Both ETFs do have a mix of high-yield stocks and growth stocks, but the yields aren't that big, with XLE having a dividend yield of just 0.8% and VOX having a dividend yield of 1%. Two very similar ETFs with similar results, similar expense fees, and what you're about to see, similar holdings. Let's take a look at those top holdings. Beginning with XLC, top holdings include Meta, Alphabet, Netflix, Walt Disney, Verizon Communications. For VOX or VOX, it's Meta, Alphabet, Netflix, Verizon, Comcast, and Disney. In total, XLC has 23 positions. VOX has 120 positions. So it really comes down to, again, exposure and how many holdings, how wide of a net you want to cast when it comes to communication services. And now we move on to the 10th sector within the S&P 500, which is utilities. This is about as defensive a sector as you can get. A lot of investors don't go to utilities for growth. What they don't offer in growth, though, utilities makes up for in terms of yield. This isn't really much of a sophisticated sector, so here we're only going to cover one ETF, and that ETF is XLU, the Utilities Select Sector Spider ETF. Over the past 10 years, XLU has a total return rate of 111%. In terms of the expense fee, XLU has an expense fee of 0.09%, so a great low-cost option, and it also has the second highest yield of all the ETFs we looked at today, with a dividend yield of 3.5%. Now let's take a look at the top holdings within XLU. It includes NextEra Energy, which is actually a position I hold and have been looking to increase my position in. It has a stable 13% exposure rate within XLU. It is then followed by Southern Company, Duke Energy, Sempra, and American Electric Power. In total, it has 31 total positions, with the top 10 accounting for nearly 60%. And that leads us to our 11th sector, which is the real estate sector. Last but certainly not least, I cover extensively REITs on this channel. As many of you know, I carve out roughly 15% of my entire portfolio towards REITs to give me that real estate exposure. This is the newest addition to the S&P 500 in terms of sectors. Before, real estate was lumped in with financials, but back in 2016, they carved it out and made it its very own S&P 500 sector. Given how deep and how extensive I cover the REIT sector, I typically don't invest in REIT ETFs because from top to bottom, it can sway from high quality to very low quality REITs. It's a very broad range, and I only want to own the best within this particular sector. However, if you're more hands-off and don't cover them as much as I do, the VNQ, the Vanguard Real Estate ETF, is going to be a great option, with most of the top 10 included within my portfolio. In terms of total return, when we're looking at the past 10 years, VNQ, the Vanguard Real Estate ETF, has a total return of 128%. REITs are a great way to add real estate exposure to your portfolio. However, they can predicate a lot due to monetary policy. Over the past 18 months, REITs have been under pressure due to this high interest rate environment that we've been going through. However, as rates are expected to come down, we could see this sector getting much of a tailwind towards the back end of 2024. In terms of the expense fee, VNQ has an expense fee of 0.12%, and it also produces the highest dividend yield on today's list, with VNQ producing a dividend yield of 4.4%. Now let's take a look at the ETF's top holdings, which include the Vanguard Real Estate 2 Index, which includes actually these other following REITs that you see on this list, including the likes of Prologis, American Tower, Equinix, Crown Castle, Simon Property Group, Realty Income, Public Storage, Welltower, and Digital Realty Trust. Overall, it has 163 total REITs, with the top 10 accounting for nearly 50%. So there we just looked at some of the top ETFs in all 11 sectors. Down in the comment section below, let me know which sector are you exposed to most within your portfolio. And if you haven't done so yet, make sure you smash that like button down below. Subscribe to the channel, and we'll see you in the next one. Take care.